Hello, welcome to Unit 6 of our course. This is the sixth and final unit of the course, and I look forward to working with you. In this unit, we will be addressing recent developments in American history. We will be focusing on the period roughly from 2000 to the present. There are two major themes that are addressed in this unit. The first is the global war on terror, and the second is global climate change. There are a number of assignments that you are asked to complete for this unit. You are asked to participate in a discussion board, which focuses on the September 11th attacks. You are asked to watch a documentary video about the September 11th attacks. It's entitled Bill Moyer's Journal, 911 for the Record, and you are asked to write a commentary about that film. And then finally, you are asked to read a feature essay about global climate change. It's entitled An Inconvenient Truth, the Controversy Surrounding Global Warming, and there are questions related to that reading. Also remember that your research paper for the course is due at the end of this unit, the end of Unit 6. I know that September 11th can be a very difficult topic to discuss. It's an event that we all have memory of, and it was a very violent and traumatic event. So I am sensitive to the fact that it is a difficult topic to converse about and to discuss. I do think, though, it is an important topic to cover in a course related to contemporary American history, because in many ways the September 11th attacks have shaped the last 14 years of American history and are likely to have an impact going into the future as well. So I appreciate your participation in the discussion of this topic. I'd like to begin by providing a little bit of background of what led up to the September 11th attacks. I think a narrative of this has to bring us back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was trying to maintain a communist government in Afghanistan. The communist government in Afghanistan was threatened by revolution, and the forces of revolution in Afghanistan were forces committed to Islamic fundamentalism, a very radical form of Islam. So the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and found itself at war with various Islamic fundamentalist groups, not just in Afghanistan, but from across the region. Foreign fighters flooded into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And at this point, the United States supported the war against the Soviets. This is during the Cold War. President Jimmy Carter condemned the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The United States boycotted the Olympic Games that were to be held in Moscow as a result. And the United States began providing arms, weapons, to Islamic fundamentalist groups in Afghanistan who were fighting the Soviets. Among these groups were the Mujahideen, or the Army of God. The Central Intelligence Agency also assisted the Islamic fundamentalist groups fighting against the Soviets. Ultimately, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a failure. The Soviets suffered massive casualties and were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan during the Reagan administration. And some have argued that this failure in Afghanistan helped to precipitate the decline of the Soviet Union. Now, this provided training and military experience for a huge group of radicals from across the Middle East. Fast forward a bit, in 1990, Iraq, which was led by a brutal dictator named Saddam Hussein, invaded the small oil-rich country of Kuwait. So Iraq invaded its neighbor to the south, Kuwait, and quickly conquered Kuwait. The Saudi royal family was concerned that Iraqi forces might also invade Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi royal family asked the United States government, at this point the first President Bush was in office, for assistance. Asked the United States for assistance. And this began Operation Desert Shield. The United States sent a very large military force to Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi Arabia against any possible Iraqi invasion. Meanwhile, President Bush reached out to other allies and formed a very broad coalition against Saddam Hussein's government and regime. In 1991, Operation Desert Storm commences. The United States and its allies invade Iraq, drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, invade Iraq, and devastate the Iraqi military. Saddam Hussein is left in power. Now, some of those Islamic radical and fundamentalist groups begin to turn against the United States. Most prominently, Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was born into an incredibly wealthy Saudi family. However, he broke away from his family and became an Islamic fundamentalist. Osama bin Laden traveled to Afghanistan in the 1980s and participated in the war against the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden became radicalized. He opposed the Saudi government, as most Islamic fundamentalists were opposed to the Saudi royal family. And this opposition to the Saudis became more intense with Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. And Osama bin Laden at this point turns his hostility against the United States. Osama bin Laden organizes a terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda. And after the Soviets were driven out of Afghanistan and the Soviet Union collapsed, Al-Qaeda turns its attention against the United States. Osama bin Laden condemns the United States military presence in Saudi Arabia. Islamic fundamentalists view Saudi Arabia as a holy land, and he condemns the presence of quote-unquote infidels, Christians, within the Saudi Holy Land, and condemns the U.S. invasion of Iraq as well. In 1991, Osama bin Laden declares war against the United States. The United States does not seem to have taken this threat very seriously initially. Osama bin Laden was not the leader of a nation. He was living in exile. He couldn't return to Saudi Arabia. So he wasn't the head of a state. He was the head of a terrorist group. Very soon, though, this terrorist organization began to carry out attacks against the United States and its interests overseas. In the early 1990s, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates carry out an attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. This is many years before the September 11th attacks. In 1993, a bomb is detonated in the underground parking garage of one of the World Trade Center buildings. The goal of the terrorists involved was to literally blow up the building and kill thousands of people. The bomb fortunately was not powerful enough to take down the building, but 6 people were killed and other people were injured in the bombing. And it was revealed that this was a radical fundamentalist attack. A number of individuals were prosecuted and put in prison. Then, in 1998, 2 American embassies in East Africa were bombed. The U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed by Al-Qaeda. Truck bombs were used, and several hundred people were killed. Then again, moving forward, in the year 2000, Al-Qaeda organized an attack on a U.S. naval vessel, the USS Cole. The USS Cole was bombed. A small boat moved up alongside the Cole when it was in harbor and in port in Yemen, and plastic explosives blew a hole in the ship, killing 17 sailors and wounding 39 others, damaging the USS Cole, a destroyer, so heavily that it had to be towed back to the United States for repairs. So a number of attacks indicated that Al-Qaeda was very, very deadly serious about carrying out attacks on the United States. These attacks had taken place during the Clinton administration, and the United States did take some actions in response to these attacks. The United States arrested terrorists and prosecuted them. President Clinton also ordered that Tomahawk cruise missiles be fired against Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan. At this point, Al-Qaeda was centered in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a very radical government. The group in charge in Afghanistan was known as the Taliban. The Taliban had taken power shortly after the Soviets had been driven out of Afghanistan. The Taliban was an Islamic fundamentalist group, and the Taliban was an incredibly radical government. They, for example, prohibited all Western music in Afghanistan. All Western music was destroyed. Anyone found playing Western music would be executed. The Taliban prohibited men from shaving. Men were required to have beards. Any man who was found clean-shaven would be beheaded by the Taliban. The Taliban declared that all women in Afghanistan must wear a full body covering, covering themselves from head to toe, concealing even their faces. Any woman found not wearing this would be beaten or even possibly punished even more severely. Women were required to be escorted by a male relative whenever they were in public. So women could not walk the streets in Afghanistan now without being escorted by a male relative. And all schools for girls were closed. Women were prohibited from receiving any education. So a very radical regime. Christian missionaries were executed in Afghanistan. Buddhist shrines and temples were blown up and destroyed. And in this setting, Al-Qaeda was able to flourish with the support of the Taliban. Now, George W. Bush becomes president, and as he becomes president, the Clinton administration does warn the incoming Bush administration that the most serious threat to the United States is Al-Qaeda. By this point, it's fairly clear that Al-Qaeda obviously is intent on launching attacks against the United States. On September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda carries out a massive attack against the United States. 4 civilian airliners are hijacked on the early morning hours of September 11th, 2001. And they're hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists who fly these aircraft into buildings. 2 of the aircraft are flown into both of the World Trade Center towers in New York City. 1 of the aircraft is crashed into the Pentagon building, which is the headquarters of the United States military outside of Washington, D.C. A fourth aircraft was headed towards Washington, but the passengers on board overpowered the terrorists, and the plane crashed in a field in a rural area of Pennsylvania without reaching any target. The loss of life was tremendously high as a result of these terrorist attacks. Both of the World Trade Center buildings in New York City, which typically employ up to 50,000 people worked in the buildings each day, both of these towers collapsed, killing thousands of people, and many people were, fewer, but many people were killed in the attack on the Pentagon as well. Of course, all of the people on board the 4 aircraft that were hijacked died as well. These were suicide attacks by the hijackers. It was the most devastating terrorist attack on the United States in American history, and deeply affected really all Americans and people from across the world. People from over 80 nations were killed in the attacks. Not surprisingly, people from many different countries work in the World Trade Center. This was meant to be an attack on the symbols of American capitalism and American military power. Just to share a bit of my own experiences of that day, I was, in 2001, I had just started graduate school at SUNY Cortland. Cortland is, a relatively small town in the southern tier of New York, near Binghamton. I had just moved from my hometown in Rome out to Cortland and got an apartment off campus. It was the first time I had lived away at home. As an undergraduate student, I had commuted from my parents' home to campus. So it was the first time I had lived on my own. And my classes had started that September, and I was pursuing a master's degree in history. I did not hear about the attacks initially. At about 7 in the morning that day, I'd gotten up early. At 7:30, I had left my apartment to go to campus, and by 8 o'clock in the morning, I was reading in the library. I was reading a book about medieval European history in the library. I had turned off my cell phone. I didn't want to disturb people in the library. And up until about 11:30 that day, I hadn't heard anything about the attacks. I decided around 11:30 to take a break, to go get lunch. I turned on my cell phone, and I realized I had a lot of messages from my parents. And I worried that something might be wrong. So I called my parents' house and reached my mother answered the phone, and she was obviously very upset and described kind of frantically what had gone on, that there had been planes crashing into buildings in the World Trade Center, the Pentagon. She said that another plane had crashed into the State Department building, which was an early report, although that proved not to be true, and that the United States was under attack. It was all very difficult to take in, what was going on exactly. So I spoke with her for a while, and I decided to return to my apartment so that I could turn on the news and watch what was going on. And then for several hours I watched the reporting. By that point, both of the Twin Towers had already collapsed, and it was very clear that many, many people had been killed. No one knew exactly how many, but many people had died, or many people had been injured. It was all very overwhelming. I was fortunate in that I did not have any family living in New York City. I didn't have any close friends living in New York City or in Washington. So I was reasonably certain that none of my family or close friends were killed or injured in the attacks. But it was still very overwhelming to see the horrible violence of that day. That afternoon, I drove back to campus. I was supposed to work in the library. I didn't realize that the school had been closed. Someone told me that the school had been closed when I got there, and I returned back to my apartment. It was very bizarre to see and traumatic to see all of the horrific suffering taking place that day. So just a bit about my own experiences of the day. Of course, after the September 11th attacks, there were investigations about how this could take place. The film that you're watching, Bill Moyer's Journal 911 for the Record, will address this question of why America's intelligence agencies didn't know more and how such attacks could take place. Following the September 11th attacks, George W. Bush and Congress declared that we would be launching a global war against terrorism. The first step in this took place in October when the United States began to launch military actions in Afghanistan against both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, to shift gears a bit, another major issue that has emerged in the 21st century is global climate change. As you're likely aware, there's a tremendous concern with global climate change. As a result of industrialization, economic development, the use of automobiles, a huge amount of carbon has been dumped into the atmosphere, essentially. And almost all scientists really, believe that this is creating a greenhouse effect, that the carbon that has been put into the atmosphere is trapping heat in our atmosphere and causing the global temperature of the Earth to rise. And there's a concern about what effect this will have on the climate of the Earth. It's very clear that it has caused ice to melt in Antarctica and the North Pole. It has caused sea levels to rise, and global temperatures have risen as well. It has almost certainly contributed to more devastating storms. As the temperature of the ocean rises, we're likely to see more frequent and more serious hurricanes, for example, and typhoons. And there's concern particularly for low-lying areas. For example, Bangladesh, much of the country is at or below sea level. The Low Countries in Europe are often at or below sea level. Parts of New Orleans and Florida are at or below sea level. That over time, as oceans rise, that these heavily populated coastal areas might become increasingly uninhabitable. One individual who has taken a strong stance on global warming is Al Gore. Al Gore served as the vice president to Bill Clinton in the 1990s and ran for president himself, of course. He was involved in the production of a film called An Inconvenient Truth, which dealt with the issue of global warming. And the essay that you're reading will address this topic as well. So I hope that you will find this to be an interesting unit. I think it addresses very important issues in our contemporary world. I look forward to working with you during this unit. In the past, I've found that the discussion surrounding September 11th has been very powerful, and I think is a very important discussion to have. So I look forward to working with you during this unit. Thank you for your participation.